Mexican military forces confirmed the death of a high-priority organized crime target during a military operation in Tapalpa, Jalisco, on February 9, 2025. The individual led one of Mexico's largest drug trafficking organizations, with operations spanning multiple states and international trafficking routes into the United States. The death triggered immediate violent responses in several Mexican states and prompted security alerts from both Mexican and U.S. authorities. This development occurs within the broader context of Mexico's long-standing confrontation with organized crime groups and ongoing debate over enforcement strategies. This analysis examines 8 interconnected elements. First, the confirmed circumstances of the military operation and death. Second, the documented operational scope of the organization involved. Third, the immediate violent response and its geographic spread. Fourth, the analytical framework known as kingpin strategy and its documented outcomes. Fifth, the structural implications of leadership removal on organizational stability. Sixth, the role of cross-border intelligence cooperation. Seventh, the political framing and policy implications. Eighth, the security response from Mexican and U.S. authorities. Mexican Defense Secretary Luis Crescencio Sandoval confirmed during a press conference on February 9th that military forces conducted an operation in Tapalpa, Jalisco that resulted in the death of the targeted individual. According to official statements, the operation began in the early morning hours. Armed confrontation occurred between military forces and security personnel protecting the target. The individual sustained injuries during the confrontation and was detained. He died while being transported by helicopter to Mexico City for medical treatment and processing. The Mexican military has not released complete operational details, citing ongoing security operations. The government confirmed the identity through fingerprint verification. The body was transferred to Mexico City for autopsy and formal identification procedures. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum addressed the operation during her morning press conference, characterizing it as a significant security achievement. The timing and location are notable. Tapalpa is a small town in Jalisco State with a population of approximately 15,000. The area is not typically associated with major cartel presence, suggesting the target was using the location to avoid detection. The operation's success, after years of unsuccessful attempts, raises questions about intelligence methods and possible changes in the target's security protocols. The organization led by the deceased individual operates under the designation Jalisco New Generation Cartel, commonly abbreviated as CJNG. The group emerged in approximately 2010, following the fragmentation of previous organizations. Mexican and U.S. authorities describe it as one of the most powerful criminal organizations operating in Mexico, with presence in multiple states and international operations. Documented activities attributed to this organization include production and trafficking of methamphetamine, cocaine, and synthetic opioids, including fentanyl. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has identified the organization as a primary source of fentanyl entering the United States. Beyond drug trafficking, Mexican authorities have documented involvement in fuel theft from state oil infrastructure, illegal mining operations, extortion of businesses, migrant smuggling, and control of local criminal markets in territories under their influence. The organizational structure combines elements of both hierarchical command and decentralized cell operations. The leadership maintained control over strategic decisions while allowing regional leaders operational autonomy within their territories. This hybrid structure provided both coordination capacity and operational flexibility. The scale of operations is substantial. Mexican security analysis estimates the organization operated in approximately 28 of Mexico's 32 states. International operations extended into the United States, Central America, South America, Europe, and Asia. The financial scale of operations has been estimated in billions of dollars annually, though precise figures are difficult to verify due to the illicit nature of activities. Within hours of the confirmed death, violent incidents occurred across multiple Mexican states. Reports documented vehicle fires in Guadalajara, Jalisco's capital, with a metropolitan population exceeding 5 million. Similar incidents occurred in Colima, Guanajuato, and other locations. The pattern involved setting fire to commercial vehicles, public transportation, and private cars to create roadblocks and demonstrate organizational capacity to disrupt normal activity. Mexican authorities reported dozens of vehicles burned in Guadalajara alone. The incidents forced closure of major roadways and disrupted commercial activity. Schools in affected areas suspended classes. Some businesses closed temporarily. The violence did not initially involve direct confrontation with security forces, but rather focused on property destruction and intimidation through disruption of public order. The U.S. State Department issued a security alert advising U.S. citizens in Jalisco and Guanajuato states to shelter in place and avoid unnecessary travel. The U.S. consulate in Guadalajara restricted movement of consular personnel. Airlines reported some flight delays and cancellations as passengers avoided travel to affected areas. These responses represent a documented pattern following leadership targeting of major criminal organizations in Mexico. Previous removals of high-value targets have triggered similar demonstrations of organizational capacity through visible disruption of public activity. The strategic purpose appears to be signaling continued operational capability despite leadership loss and creating public pressure on authorities through disruption of daily life. The enforcement approach of targeting organizational leaders is commonly termed kingpin strategy. This strategy operates on the theory that removing leadership will disrupt organizational function, reduce operational capacity, and potentially cause organizational collapse or fragmentation into smaller, less capable groups. The strategy has been applied extensively in Mexico since 2006, when then-President Felipe Calderón deployed military forces in large-scale operations against drug trafficking organizations. Over nearly 2 decades, dozens of major organizational leaders have been killed or captured. These include leaders of organizations operating in various regions, including Tijuana, Juarez, Gulf Coast, Pacific Coast, and Central Mexico. The documented outcomes of this strategy show mixed results. Some organizations did fragment following leadership removal. The Tijuana organization split into multiple competing factions. The Gulf organization divided into several successor groups. However, fragmentation did not eliminate criminal activity, but rather redistributed it among multiple actors, often increasing violence as groups competed for territory and resources. Other organizations demonstrated resilience and continuity despite leadership changes. Succession mechanisms allowed new leaders to assume control with minimal disruption. In some cases, captured or killed leaders were replaced by individuals who proved equally or more capable. Academic analysis of kingpin strategy effectiveness has produced extensive literature. Studies examining violence rates, drug production levels, trafficking volumes, and organizational capacity show that leadership removal alone does not consistently reduce these metrics. Some studies document short-term disruptions followed by operational recovery. Others document increased violence during succession struggles. The debate centers on whether the strategy addresses root causes of organized crime, including demand for illegal substances, corruption of institutions, limited economic opportunities in affected regions, and weak rule of law. Critics argue that removing individuals does not alter the structural conditions that enable criminal organizations to recruit, operate, and generate revenue. Defenders argue that persistent pressure on leadership imposes costs on organizations and prevents consolidation of power that could pose even greater challenges to state authority. The organizational structure of the particular group involved in this case presents specific analytical challenges. According to Mexican security analysts, the deceased leader maintained highly centralized control over strategic decisions and operated with minimal formal succession planning. This differs from some organizations that have developed more institutionalized succession processes or distributed leadership structures. The centralized model created operational efficiency and reduced internal conflict during the leader's tenure. However, it also creates vulnerability when leadership is removed. Without a clearly designated successor, multiple senior figures may compete for control. Mexican authorities have identified at least 3 to 5 senior members who could potentially attempt to assume leadership. The fragmentation scenario would involve these figures competing for control of territories, trafficking routes, and operational assets. This competition typically involves violence between factions, efforts to recruit personnel from rival factions, and attempts to secure external support from suppliers or other organizations. The violence affects not only competing factions, but also civilians in contested territories through collateral damage and intimidation tactics. Historical precedent from other Mexican organizations that experience similar leadership vacuums shows violence increases of 30 to 50% in affected regions during succession struggles lasting 6 months to 2 years. Economic activity in affected areas declines as businesses face increased extortion pressure and reduced security. Migration from affected areas increases as civilians seek to escape violence. The alternative scenario involves rapid consolidation under a single successor with sufficient authority to maintain organizational cohesion. This requires that the successor is widely accepted by regional commanders, has established relationships with key personnel, and can demonstrate capacity to maintain operational continuity. Even in this scenario, some degree of internal testing and minor fracturing typically occurs as the new leader establishes authority. A third scenario involves intervention by competing organizations seeking to exploit the power vacuum. Other major criminal organizations operating in Mexico could attempt to expand into territories previously controlled by the now leaderless group. This external pressure complicates internal succession dynamics and can trigger multi-party conflicts. U.S. and Mexican officials have indicated that intelligence cooperation contributed to locating the target. The specific nature of cooperation has not been fully disclosed. Typical cooperation mechanisms include signals intelligence, financial tracking, human intelligence sources, and surveillance technology. The U.S. maintains Drug Enforcement Administration, Federal Bureau of Investigation, and intelligence agency presence in Mexico with formal cooperation agreements. The operation itself was conducted exclusively by Mexican military forces. This maintains Mexican sovereignty over enforcement operations within Mexican territory while allowing intelligence sharing. This model has been standard for high-priority operations following diplomatic tensions that arose when U.S. agents participated directly in operations on Mexican soil. The cooperation raises questions about information security and source protection. Criminal organizations have demonstrated capacity to infiltrate Mexican security institutions. Leaked information from previous operations has compromised security and endangered personnel. The successful operation suggests that intelligence was compartmentalized and operational security was maintained, though full assessment is not possible without access to classified details. Cross-border cooperation on organized crime has been a consistent element of U.S. Mexico relations, but has also been a source of tension. Mexican governments have at times resisted extensive U.S. involvement as infringement on sovereignty. U.S. governments have at times expressed frustration with corruption within Mexican institutions and perceived insufficient action against trafficking organizations. The current Mexican administration under President Sheinbaum has indicated willingness to cooperate on security matters while maintaining that operations within Mexico will be conducted by Mexican forces. This represents continuity with previous policy frameworks while potentially adjusting operational priorities. The death of a high-profile organized crime leader creates immediate political value for both Mexican and U.S. governments. For Mexico, it demonstrates enforcement capacity and willingness to confront major criminal organizations. This addresses domestic criticism regarding security strategy and international pressure regarding drug trafficking. For the United States, the operation addresses ongoing pressure regarding fentanyl flows. U.S. officials have identified synthetic opioids as a primary public health crisis with overdose deaths exceeding 70,000 annually in recent years. The organization led by the deceased individual was identified as a major source of fentanyl entering the United States. The operation allows U.S. officials to point to concrete enforcement action. However, the structural impact remains uncertain. Drug trafficking organizations operate as business enterprises responding to market demand. The demand for illegal substances in the United States has not decreased. The profitability of trafficking operations remains high. These fundamental market dynamics continue regardless of leadership changes in supply organizations. The analytical question is whether enforcement operations targeting leadership affect these market dynamics. Economic analysis suggests that leadership removal may temporarily increase costs for trafficking organizations through operational disruption, but that these costs are typically absorbed within the large profit margins of illegal drug markets. Supply to U.S. markets has historically shown resilience despite extensive enforcement efforts. Alternative approaches focusing on demand reduction, treatment expansion, and harm reduction have been proposed as complements or alternatives to supply-side enforcement. However, political resistance to such approaches remains significant in many jurisdictions. The debate over optimal drug policy continues with different jurisdictions implementing different approaches. The U.S. State Department issued a security alert on February 9th covering Jalisco and Guanajuato states. The alert advised U.S. citizens to shelter in place, avoid unnecessary travel, monitor local media, and maintain awareness of surroundings. The alert noted potential for continued violence and disruption. U.S. Embassy and consulate personnel in affected areas received movement restrictions limiting non-essential travel. These restrictions are standard protocol during periods of elevated security risk and are designed to reduce exposure of diplomatic personnel to potential violence. Mexican authorities deployed additional military and National Guard personnel to Guadalajara and other affected cities. Checkpoints were established on major roadways. Patrols were increased in commercial and tourist areas. The visible security presence aims to deter further violence and reassure the public. Tourist industry representatives expressed concern about potential economic impact. Guadalajara receives significant domestic and international tourism. The city hosts major cultural events and serves as a business hub for Western Mexico. Prolonged security concerns could affect hotel occupancy, restaurant business, and event attendance. The broader security impact depends on the duration and intensity of any succession struggle. If violence remains limited to property destruction and faction-on-faction conflict, impact on general population may be contained. If violence expands to include broader intimidation tactics, or if public spaces become conflict zones, the impact on daily life and economic activity increases substantially. Historical patterns from previous leadership removals show that intense violence typically peaks within the first 2 to 3 months following the removal, then gradually declines as succession resolves or as surviving factions establish territorial divisions. However, each case has unique characteristics and precedent provides only general guidance. To summarize the core analytical findings, Mexican military forces confirmed the death of a major organized crime leader during an operation in Jalisco state. The organization he led operates extensive drug trafficking, particularly fentanyl, along with diversified criminal activities across multiple states and international routes. Immediate violent responses occurred in several Mexican states, demonstrating organizational capacity to disrupt public order. The kingpin strategy of leadership targeting shows mixed effectiveness with documented cases of both organizational fragmentation and resilient succession. The centralized leadership structure of this particular organization creates elevated risk of fragmentation and succession violence. U.S. Mexico intelligence cooperation contributed to the operation while maintaining Mexican operational control. The death provides political value for both governments in addressing domestic and international pressure regarding drug trafficking. Security alerts and increased military presence reflect official concern about potential escalation. The long-term structural impact on drug trafficking operations remains uncertain given continued market demand and organizational resilience. What remains uncertain is which succession scenario will materialize and over what time frame. Whether the organization will fragment into competing factions, consolidate under a single successor, or face territorial challenges from competing organizations cannot be determined without additional information about internal organizational dynamics and decision-making by senior members. The duration and intensity of any violence associated with succession, the effectiveness of security force responses, and the broader economic and social impact in affected regions will depend on these uncertain factors. The key variables shaping developments over the next 3 to 6 months include the emergence or non-emergence of a widely accepted successor, the response of competing criminal organizations to perceived vulnerability, the capacity of Mexican security forces to contain violence, and the resilience of supply chains feeding drug trafficking operations. The analytical focus remains on documented organizational behavior patterns, security force capabilities, and structural market dynamics rather than on moral assessments of criminal actors or policy advocacy. Further developments will be tracked through official government statements, security incident reports, and analytical assessments from security researchers and institutions. The emphasis remains on verified information and structural analysis of organized crime dynamics and security policy frameworks.